Rabbi Zobin, thank you so much for joining us again on JTV. It's really appreciated. The fact that you're going to come here, take some more of our questions. So let's just jump right into them. There's a quote, I think it was Gandhi, who said, "An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind." And from what the way I grew up and the way I understood Judaism was that this eye for an eye thing was to be taken literally. And I had non-Jewish friends who would often use that as a critique for the Old Testament. They would see it as like, it's very tit for tat, that concept of an eye for an eye. And my question, first of all, would be, has the eye for an eye thing given the Torah a bad reputation, number one? And number two, I understood also that it's not meant to be taken literally, although it's only applying to certain specific matters like monetary matters. But I've also heard some people say that originally it was actually taken literally and only later on it was re-understood. So two questions. Number one, has it, even whether it's meant to be taken literally or not, has it given us the Torah a bad reputation? And is it a real tit-for-tat thing? And number two, have we changed the way we've understood it throughout history?
Yeah. So I think you're definitely right. It's often quoted as the Old Testament God, the biblical God of vengeance and strict justice, often contrasted with the Christian God who somehow is kinder and more merciful.
Yeah.
Lex talionis is what it's called, the idea of taking an eye for an eye. I think that actually it's a good example of how important it is to look at sources from within themselves, and in this particular case, be sure that one is even just translating the terms correctly. When one sees a clash of values and a very different approach and way of thinking about things between, in this particular case, biblical justice and the way we see things in modernity, one does need to evaluate both systems and sometimes perhaps not jump to the conclusion that how we happen to see things in 2019 is the way absolute moral standards need or ought to be. But equally, one needs to check that one's understood the verses in the Torah correctly. Now, the Torah as accessed by many people is often an English translation, perhaps the King James translation, which itself is a translation from the Latin, which itself is a translation from the Greek, which itself was a translation from the original Hebrew. And a lot gets lost in translation. So let's just take a look at the Hebrew itself. And there is no verse that says an eye for an eye. The correct pasuk, as it says it, is ayin, an eye, tachat, ayin. Tachat means underneath or in place of. So ayin, tachat, ayin, shein, tachat, shein. A tooth in place of a tooth. Petza, tachat, patza, a wound in place of a wound. Chabura, tachat, chabura, an injury in place of an injury. So the pasuk itself does not say an eye for an eye in this particular context. It says ayin tachat ayin, an eye underneath or in place of an eye. Mm-hmm. In the same verse itself, it also talks about giving an ayin tachat an ayin. Now, if you merely punish the aggressor by wounding them and removing their eye as a punishment for what they've done to their victim, you're not giving anything, it's actually an act of taking. So both elements of the language should be wake-up calls to us to think whether we've actually understood the pasuk and the verse correctly at all. Ayin tachat ayin would sound like you should give an eye in place of an eye. In other words, you have injured someone by attacking them, you've given them a wound or a burn, kavir tachat kavir, a burn, knocked out a tooth or an eye. Give them an eye underneath, in place of the eye that you took away. In other words, replace their lost eye. Now, science, currently, and certainly in the times of the Torah and the Talmud, we're not in a position in which we can replace someone's eye and give them an eye transplant. So what can we do? We can replace their lost eye to the best of our abilities.
But it doesn't mean take the eye of the person that took out the eye.
Well, if we think about the translation, an eye underneath an eye or in place means replace the eye. So how would we replace the eye? Well, first of all, by medical treatment, so healing the person directly from the injury. Secondly, by thinking about lost earnings. How has this crippled or disabled them and made them unable to operate and function? Has this affected them on the monetary level? Has this caused them pain? Has this caused them embarrassment or emotional trauma? Has this meant that for a period of time they've been unable to work? which are exactly the 5 categories of damage that the Talmud identifies. So Talmud reads this verse as saying, replace their eye with an eye. Do your best to fill in that hole, that gap that's been created in their lives through the loss of a limb or through the burn or the pain that they've been caused. And therefore replace it in a very sophisticated way, actually, with medical treatment, with loss of earnings, with compensation for pain, compensation for emotional pain and embarrassment, and for the healing itself. And therefore, that is how the Talmud takes it. And I don't see this as an example necessarily of biblical vengeful justice. Quite the contrary. I think if we read the Pasuk in its original Hebrew, this is a reminder of how important it is to check that we're accurately translating verses. And I would use this really as a springboard for discussing numerous verses which are mistranslated. And Jewish education is out there. If people can take the chance to learn the original Hebrew, to access the sources in their original, and to really see these sorts of challenges and difficulties as an opportunity to do a little bit more research and check what's really going on, this makes all the difference. And we can discuss other examples if you want of mistranslated verses.
Well, I would like to get there, but the 2 questions that I'm really focused on is, number one, okay, fine, so maybe it's been people haven't understood what it really means.
Yes.
But would you agree that the misunderstanding has given the Torah a bad reputation in that sense?
I think it has. There are cases, I should say, very rare cases, extraordinary cases, in which the Torah might see something like this as a fair system of justice. There's a famous example of a certain scenario in which false witnesses falsely accuse, misuse and abuse the court and justice system to make false claims against a supposed criminal, and it turns out that this is made up, that the criminal was not a criminal, in which perhaps the correct response, and in certain scenarios the Torah says, the appropriate punishment is to give to them the punishment that they wanted to cause their victim. And I think in that case we should do a little bit of thinking about why actually does that bother us? Who says that's a wrong punishment? Why can't it be that a system of justice, particularly in that scenario, in which someone has abused the justice system, should be to apply to them the penalty that they wanted to impose on their victim, the supposed criminal? So there are cases where maybe that's an equitable way of doing justice, and actually in a system of law which sees punishment as educative, the empathy and understanding and insight as to what they wanted to do to their victim, and them in turn being punished in the same or similar manner, may be just. And therefore if they wanted to impose a financial penalty on their victim by falsely giving evidence in court, they themselves would have to pay that financial penalty. And I don't think we should assume that that's a flawed system of justice. But as it happens, this particular case is a misreading of the simple translation of the verse. The verse simply says tachat ein, and the Torah knew how to write. In the case of the false witnesses, it would have quite easily been able to express itself otherwise, had it intended for this to be genuinely a lex talionis type punishment.
Yeah.
So those that wish to misquote, either deliberately or mistakenly, through lack of research and misunderstand what a pasuk means, yes, there's always bound to be half fallout.
And there's not much we can do about that in that sense.
There's not much we can do about that, no.
Yeah. And what do you say to the fact that, I once heard a speaker talking about the fact that it was meant literally at one point in terms of take out, and I think there are even some commentaries which said it was originally meant literally, and only later, by the rabbis of the Talmud, reinterpreted. Is that true?
Yeah. In this particular case, it's difficult. I'm not a historian. I don't know if historians do know or can know how this was interpreted through 3,500 years of Jewish history. It is correct and true that in some of the legal codes, Hammurabi's code and others, that were there in the ancient Near East, lex talionis was applied. And if you have an assumption that the biblical code must be identical to that of the other ancient codes, and perhaps one buys into a worldview in which somehow those codes triggered the nature and information within the Torah, then one might assume that this is what the Torah meant. I would say that the assumption that the Torah was directly influenced by these other ancient legal systems is not clear-cut. There isn't clear and obvious evidence for it. But equally, Dibra Torah b'lashon bnei Adam, the Torah speaks in the language of men, and it is clear and obvious that what we have in Torah is a wonderful legal system from which concepts can be drawn out that can be applied in modernity, but equally that use scenarios that were prevalent at the time. So it's not surprising that both Hammurabi's code and the Torah speak about similar sorts of scenarios. They speak about circumstances that existed in the ancient Near East. They speak about oxes goring other animals. They speak about sheep and lambs and goats being stolen. They speak about financial misdemeanors that are common and similar. So it's dealing with the same sort of society, and of course, therefore, there's similar sort of terms used. But very often, actually, the Torah undermines and sort of uses similar language to create a very different dynamic. I'll give you a remarkable example of this. In some of the ancient codes of law in the Near East, Hammurabi's code, as far as I remember, it says that if a slave escapes and is caught, you cut off his ear. And the Torah tells us that if you have a slave, and in Jewish law, a slave would be a bondsman who would stay in slavery for 6 years and then be released, who says, I want to stay on. Someone who has a slave mentality and wants to stay on in slavery, what do? You give a token boring of the ear. So this is a token small injury in which you actually say, no, you want to stay as a slave. We're going to do this token hole piercing of the ear, perhaps deliberately mirroring the system at work in other legal systems in which the ear was cut off as a punishment for wanting to cease to be a slave. So you have the Torah taking prevalent norms and almost turning them on their head and saying, no, the very system of law in which it says for wishing to cease to be a slave, we're going to punish you, we're going to say that you want to remain a slave. This isn't appropriate. This isn't the way it should be. So it could be here the Torah is deliberately playing with those words and is saying that there's a deeper and more fundamental and correct way of engaging in punishment. Now, is it possible that our understanding of this verse changed over time? It is possible. At the end of the day, we believe in a dual model of Torah. We have the written Torah, the Torah shebichtav, the Torah as a text, and then we have the concept of an oral Torah. Now, the idea of an oral Torah is often misunderstood. It's seen primarily as if it's some sort of tradition handed down through the generations. But certainly a significant part of the Torah is the right and privilege given to human beings to use our God-given gift of a mind to interpret and understand the Torah. In this way of thinking, Torah is seen as a partnership between us as the human listeners and God as the divine speaker. And the sages speak about this. They say Shivim Ponim Torah, the 70 facets to the Torah. When there's an argument and debate between two rabbis who take different perspectives, Eilu ve'elu divrei Elokim chaim. These and these, both opinions, are the words of the living God. So the sages understand that when we are approaching the divine, the infinite, for us as finite beings, we can only ever hear an aspect or an element of that. And inevitably, therefore, different listeners of divine truth, as we do our best to really hear what we're being told, might hear things slightly differently. And it's legitimate, therefore, we embrace argument. The Mishnah, the classic text of oral law, a great legal work, one of the ancient legal works, is to the best of my knowledge the only legal work that builds argument into the structure. The Mishnah is deliberately is not a closed book. It says this is the opinion of this rabbi, and this is the opinion of that rabbi. This is the consensus view, this is the minority view. And it builds that argument and debate into the system. The Gemara, as is well known, the Talmud, is a free-flow discussion. It's the record of debates that took place in the great academies in Palestine, in Eretz Israel, in Bovel, in Babylonia, the two Talmuds that we have, the Israeli Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud, and it's a record of debates and controversies and conversations that took place at the time. So we do embrace argument, and we don't have a worldview in which it's impossible that we interpret and reinterpret the words of the divine. So conceivably, it's possible that at some stages in history, maybe this was understood more literally, or I would say actually perhaps inaccurately or misunderstood in this particular example. But it's certainly possible that other well-known laws and halachot that we now keep, we keep them because this is how it was understood by the consensus view after maybe years, decades, hundreds of years of being trashed out. A particular opinion arose and that became the accepted norm, and that this was a matter of debate at certain times in Jewish history. And you can track sometimes these debates. If one makes a serious attempt at studying the Mishnah, the Talmud, and later debate, one can sometimes track arguments that have gone through hundreds of years or 1,000 years of Jewish history, and eventually over time an issue is considered resolved and it's been dealt with sufficiently and thrashed out, and then this would become normative halacha. And that's the way it works. We see Torah as a partnership between us and God. It's created through God as a speaker and us as a listener. And inevitably, as humans, we'll bring in our own understandings and insight into how we hear that. We have biblical role models for that. We have an Abraham who challenges God. Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat, the judge of all the earth, not do justice. We humans are able to turn to God and say, this is an injustice, we don't understand this. But we also then need to honestly hear God's response in turn. And therefore this, or perhaps other examples, could be cases in which, were we to find archaeological evidence that tefillin once upon a time looked a little different, these things can be debated. In our own, in more recent history, the use of electricity on Shabbat was debated, probably 100 years of debate, and a consensus has arisen about how the halachic system would address it. More cutting edge, some of the medical treatments available, whether it's from cloning to scenarios in which one can have genes from 2, 3, or 4 parents. These are issues being debated currently amongst the world of Jewish scholarship, and medical ethics remains an ongoing area of debate. And these are, we're able perfectly to apply classic principles that deal with very different life circumstances and apply them wonderfully and beautifully to modern day life. I mean, that's why Talmud is endlessly fascinating, and I would really invite every single person to enter the Beit HaMedrash and become part of those conversations.
Beit HaMedrash meaning the study hall.
The study hall of Talmud learning and Talmudic learning, and they're still there, still vibrant. You go into a yeshiva, you go into Academy of Jewish Learning, and you're hit by a blast of noise. People debating, arguing, discussing, and those debates are ongoing. They're there online and in the written word.
To stay up to date with JTV content, click subscribe here if you're on YouTube and hit the alarm bell. And if you're on Facebook, hit the like button, and under following, click see first. If you enjoy watching JTV content and want to help us continue to grow, please consider making a donation to us by clicking here.